Lecture 6 is on Descartes and Bacon, on rationalism versus empiricism, and on man's conquest of nature. Socrates is the father of Western philosophy as a whole, but René Descartes is universally regarded as the father of modern philosophy. In many ways, he was the new Socrates. I think there are 5 main reasons for this, for his newness and his importance as defining the difference between the modern and the pre-modern. And all 5 of these reasons are closely related. Almost all early modern philosophers will follow Descartes in all 5 of these new ways of thinking in general, even when they disagree with him about the specific details and doctrines of his philosophy. First, he exemplifies the subjective turn in human thought that is happening in general in Western culture and is happening in philosophy in particular. Descartes is like a teenager who first wants to know, who am I? While the pre-teenager is more unself-conscious and interested in the objective world, in objective truth, both natural and supernatural. Second, because Descartes is so self-conscious, he is obsessed with the problem of certainty. Like a teenager, he asks his teachers, how do you know that? Because his first problem is attaining not just objective truth, but personal certainty. Therefore, he's critical. That is, he begins with a kind of methodological skepticism, which he calls universal doubt, not with faith or experience or common sense. He climbs down into the pit of doubt with the skeptics in order to lead them up out of it by his new, more powerful kind of reason. Like a ladder. Most of the most intelligent philosophers of his era, the early 17th century, were in fact really skeptics, like Montaigne. And even Pascal, the greatest religious apologist of modern times, wrote his Pensées, and especially his famous wager, for skeptics. The poet William Butler Yeats wrote, "Now that my ladder's gone, I must lie down where all ladders start, in the foul rag and bone shop of the heart." Descartes tried to refute skepticism, but if that ladder collapses, he's left in the skeptical hole that he deliberately adopted. He will not begin with data, with experience, or with common sense, or with tradition, with any kind of faith, or with any authority. And if his culture, which is our culture, our modern Western culture, follows him here, maybe that is where the culture too is headed. Third, when Descartes does find his first certainty, it's not God or the world, but himself. His answer to skepticism, and the premise for the rest of his whole philosophy, is his famous argument, I think, therefore I am. Descartes puts himself as the center of his thought. If pre-Christian pagans were cosmocentric and medieval Christians were theocentric, modern post-Christians are anthropocentric. Fourth, Descartes focuses on method and gives us a new method for attaining certainty, which is essentially the scientific method applied to philosophy. His most popular book was The Discourse on Method. The scientific method is, in fact, the greatest discovery in the history of science because it unlocked all the other doors, like a skeleton key, in all the other sciences. Descartes observed the amazing progress all the other sciences were making in his day because of this new method. So he applied this method, or tried to, also to philosophy. Fifth, because this is his central quest and question, he begins with epistemology rather than metaphysics, with how to know the truth rather than what the truth is itself, with thinking about thinking rather than thinking about being. This very clearly distinguishes modern philosophy from pre-modern. Descartes examines his tools before he builds the building. He examines reason itself before using it. The problem with that program is that he trusts nothing but reason to examine and validate reason. How can reason validate itself? If all arguments are on trial, how can any one of those arguments be the judge and declare itself and all the others who are on trial to be innocent? Epistemology is that division of philosophy that studies human thought, or reason itself. And that's probably the least interesting and the most abstract and thin and merely theoretical division of philosophy for most people. Knowing the world and people is much more concrete and also much more practical and more interesting. than knowing the act of knowing. But epistemology does influence everything else in one's philosophy, just as metaphysics does, which is also not most people's cup of tea, for the same two reasons. It is abstract and not concrete, and it is theoretical rather than practical. But everything we know is an example of knowing, and thus it comes under epistemology, just as everything we know is real is an example of reality or being, and therefore comes under metaphysics. The central question in epistemology is, how do you know? That means two things: the search for certainty and the search for a method. The first is the search for a refutation of skepticism, which denies that we can be certain. And the second is the positive roadmap for reaching certainty, the steps along the way. The fundamental dispute of classical modern philosophy, from Descartes through Hegel, from the early 17th century to the early 19th century, is the right relationship between the two knowing powers that we have, namely the reason and the senses. Rationalism prioritizes the reason in three ways. First, temporally, it says that reason comes first, that we have innate ideas, innate logical principles that we do not learn from experience. Principles like the law of non-contradiction and the principle of cause and effect. We know that these principles are true, yet we do not derive them from experience. We bring them to experience. Second, critically, it says that reason judges the senses. That's the essence of rationalism. Third, it says that reason is unlimited, not limited by experience. In contrast, empiricism prioritizes our sensory experience in all three of these ways. First, temporally, it says that sense experience always comes first. Secondly, critically, it judges rational theories as theories are judged by data in all the sciences, except for mathematics. And third, in extension, it says that reason is limited by experience. So rationalism and empiricism contradict each other on three related questions that compare reason with experience. First, which of the two comes first? Second, which is the standard for judging the other? And third, whether reason is limited by experience or not. Rationalists say reason is bigger than we think. Empiricists say it is smaller than we think. Descartes is a rationalist, as was Plato, and as Spinoza and Leibniz and Hegel will be too. Francis Bacon, John Locke, and David Hume are empiricists. Aristotle was in the middle of this dispute, as he was on almost all disputes. He avoids opposite extremes. He is extremely anti-extremist. He's often called a soft empiricist rather than a hard empiricist, because he says that all human knowledge begins with sense experience, but it is not limited by it, since it can abstract universal and unchangeable and certain principles from experience of concrete examples. Hard empiricists, in contrast, deny this in epistemology, and they're also almost always nominalists in metaphysics. That is, they deny that universals are objectively real. The medieval dispute in metaphysics between the realists and the nominalists is paralleled in the reflecting pool of epistemology by the modern dispute between the rationalists and the empiricists. Kant tried to avoid both rationalism and empiricism, which he called, respectively, dogmatism and skepticism. By rationalism, he means above all Descartes, and by skepticism, he means above all David Hume, who very logically deduced from his premise of empiricism the consequence of a radical skepticism. His empiricist predecessors like Francis Bacon and John Locke had not done that. Kant tries to avoid these two extremes in a very different way than Aristotle did, namely by what he called his Copernican revolution in philosophy, and that is essentially by redefining truth itself as the conformity of the object known to the inner structures of the knowing mind, instead of vice versa. He said we do not derive our categories from our experience of the real world. Rather, we subconsciously impose them on the world, and thus we construct the world like an artist, rather than discovering it like a scientist. I contrasted Aristotle's epistemology with Kant's in Lecture 3. In this lecture, we'll do two things. First, we'll contrast Descartes' epistemology and methodology with Bacon's, And then we'll see a deeper and much more interesting unity between these two philosophers. Not in epistemology, but surprisingly in the most important question in ethics, namely, what is the greatest good in human life? Descartes begins his discourse on method by redefining the meaning of reason and making it more demanding. This has been done at least 8 times in the history of human thought. First, Socrates demanded logical proofs rather than simply accepting ideas from authority or tradition. Second, Plato demanded definitions of the so-called Platonic ideas, Platonic forms, or eternal essences. Third, Aristotle combined reason with sensation by seeing reason's power as a kind of X-ray of sense experience, so as to identify and abstract universal forms or species from concrete material examples of particular things. He gave Plato's forms a new, more earthly address. Fourth, in the Middle Ages, Christian philosophers added faith in supernatural divine revelation to natural human reason as a road to truth. This introduced divine revelation into philosophy and philosophical exploration into faith. Fifth, Descartes narrowed reason to scientific reason by applying the scientific method to philosophy, or at least the mathematical aspect of that method, especially by demanding what he called clear and distinct ideas. In other words, ideas that were more like numbers in these 2 ways. They were clear and they were distinct. Mathematics is the only universal and unambiguous language. And by this new method, Descartes hoped to end the disagreements that had always plagued philosophers, just as he observed that all the other sciences were secretly ending disagreements in science. Needless to say, this did not happen. Sixth, the hard empiricists like Hume and the so-called positivists limited reason to the ordering of sense data. They took the other aspect of the scientific method, namely using empirical data to judge all hypotheses. Seventh, Kant redefined reason as constructing its object rather than discovering it, imposing form on matter rather than abstracting form from matter. He was a sort of Aristotle turned inside out. This narrowed reason by making it impossible to have even probable knowledge of objective reality, or things in themselves. Eighth, the computer revolution is increasingly leading humanity to redefine reason as reasoning or computation. And this too is mathematical and digital. Computers cannot understand qualities, only quantities, and they cannot understand analogies, which are intuitive. All words in all languages except numbers can be used analogously. Here is Descartes' redefinition of reason. He calls it good sense or common sense, and he says it is not only common to all men, but also equal in all. But obviously, wisdom or understanding or intuition or what we might call philosophical empathy is not equal in all, and that is the reason why philosophers do not agree, as scientists do. The scientific method does not rely on or appeal to this right brain intuition, but only to sensory data, exact quantitative measurement, and logical calculation. The ability to do these 3 things are indeed equal in all, for we all have the same senses, and the same mathematics, and the same rules of logic. But we do not have the same understanding or intuitive wisdom. That narrowing of reason is how science attains agreement. And Descartes thinks he can apply this to philosophy too, and thus end differences of opinion, and perhaps even end wars, which always begin with deep differences of opinion that seem intractable, but perhaps they are not, if only we all agree to use this new, narrower, stricter, more scientific version of reason. And that's essentially the faith of the so-called Enlightenment. Descartes observed and was traumatized by the 30 Years' War about religious differences between Protestant Germany and Catholic France, and Descartes was inspired to create his new philosophy on the way home from the battlefields. What do you think Descartes would say if he were alive today and knew about the Napoleonic Wars and the wars of 1848 that involved nearly every nation in Europe, and the Bolshevik Revolution and World War I the war fought by the whole world to the death of millions over almost nothing, and the subsequent horrors like communism and World War II with fascism and Nazism and the Holocaust and over 50 million casualties, and Hiroshima and Mao Zedong, the ideological murderer of 100 million non-combatants, and Pol Pot, who murdered 1/3 of all his Cambodian citizens, and Islamic terrorism, and the ever-increasing ideological divides and culture wars of our present culture. Would Descartes not have to admit that this new God of reason and science as the source of peace and progress and heavenly happiness on earth was indeed, as Nietzsche said of the old God, quite dead? Descartes emphasized the mathematical and deductive aspect of the scientific method, while Bacon emphasized the empirical and inductive aspect of it. And that difference was the major issue that divided early modern philosophers, the theoretical issue of rationalism versus empiricism. But all of them, with the one notable exception of Pascal, had very high hopes that the scientific method would revolutionize not only philosophy but human life itself. That issue, the practical issue of human happiness and ethics and good and evil, is much more important than the theoretical issue of how we know. And on that issue, the rationalists and the empiricists are in agreement together against the pre-modern answer to the greatest of all ethical questions, the question of the summum bonum, or greatest good, the meaning of happiness or blessedness. The answer to the question, what is the meaning of life? What is the best thing we can possibly do in this world? In the concluding chapter of his Discourse on Method, Descartes gives us his answer to that question, and it is the same answer as that of Bacon. His new answer is the greatest change that can ever come over a culture, because it is a change not just about any of the means to the end, but a change about what the end is. It's like someone who is sailing a sailboat for pleasure, deciding to enlist in the Navy and consenting to be a spy with his boat. Or vice versa, a spy deciding to use his boat for pleasure. In either case, changing his mind not about how to sail, but about why to sail, about the final ultimate end and purpose and justification for everything else that he does, from navigation to paint to cleaning the head. Here is what Descartes says about the end and goal and purpose of his whole philosophy, and about how that is his reason for adopting the new scientific method, which he wants to apply to philosophy. The method is, of course, only a means, but so is the philosophy. So is truth itself, as Bacon says. It is utilitarian. It is only a means to the final end, which is not truth itself, but the power over nature that it brings us. In other words, technology. Here are Descartes' words. It is possible to arrive at knowledge that is very useful in life, and that in place of the speculative philosophy taught in the medieval schools, one can find a practical one, by which, knowing the force and actions of fire and water and air and stars and the heavens and all the other bodies that surround us, just as we understand the various skills of our craftsmen, we could, in the same way, use these objects for all the purposes for which they are fit, and thus make ourselves, as it were, masters and possessors of nature. By speculative, Descartes means not uncertain, but seeking truth for its own sake as an end, rather than as a means to use. When Descartes speaks of masters and possessors of nature, he is echoing Bacon, who clearly said that the purpose of human life on earth was not, first of all, the knowledge of the truth, which was only a means, but rather man's conquest of nature, or power, which is the end. As in Nietzsche's more radical extension of this, in his idea that the ultimate end is simply the will to power. Nietzsche questioned even the very will to truth. C.S. Lewis states this most radical and fundamental change very clearly and starkly in his prophetic masterpiece, The Abolition of Man, which I think is one of the most important books of the whole modern era, because it shows us clearly what the hidden heart of modernity leads to, what road we are on. He begins by correcting a common mistake about the data, about the historical difference between modernity and the Middle Ages. He says the real story about the birth of modern science is misunderstood. You will even find people who write about the 16th century as if magic were a medieval survival and science was the new thing that came in to sweep it away. Those who have studied the period, like Lewis himself, who wrote the still standard work of the literature of that period, the Oxford History of English Literature in the 16th century, they know better. There was very little magic in the Middle Ages. The 16th and 17th centuries were the high noon of magic. The serious magical endeavor and the serious scientific endeavor are twins. One was sickly and died, the other strong and throve, but they were twins. Lewis then states the difference between our culture and every other culture that has ever existed in human history. Very clearly, he says, there is something which unites magic and applied science, that is technology, while separating both from the wisdom of earlier ages. For the wise men of old, the cardinal problem of human life had been how to conform the soul to reality, and the solution had been knowledge, self-discipline, and virtue. For magic and applied science alike, the problem is how to subdue reality to the wishes of men. The solution is a technique, that is technology. In this spirit, Bacon condemns those who value knowledge as an end in itself. This, for him, is to use as a mistress for pleasure what ought to be a spouse for fruit. The true object is to extend man's power. Bacon rejects magic only because it doesn't work. His goal is the same as that of the magician. In other words, he is Sauron the Great, and his ring of power is technology. I think that's why we never see Sauron in The Lord of the Rings, because Sauron is ourselves. How we classify things tells a lot about our thinking. Small children asked to put away their toys into 2 boxes will sometimes put all the balls in one box and all the other toys of a different shape in another. They think structurally. Those who think functionally will put baseballs and baseball bats and fielder's mitts in one box and hockey pucks and hockey sticks and hockey nets in another box. So let's look at the way we classify 4 human enterprises, 3 of which are still serious, and all 4 of which were contending in early modern times, the time of Bacon and Descartes. How do we classify science, technology, magic, and religion? Almost everyone will classify science and technology together, and religion and magic together, for 2 good reasons. Both science and technology use the scientific method, and both appeal only to nature, not to anything supernatural, while both magic and religion transcend both the scientific method and nature. But the deeper classification, the deeper unity, is between magic and technology, and between religion and science, because, as Lewis pointed out, both magic and technology seek power over nature. Although one uses supernatural means and the other uses natural means, yet both want power. While both science and religion want truth, both science and religion seek to conform the human soul to objective reality. Although science focuses on the mind and tries to conform it to the reality of nature, while religion focuses on the will and tries to conform it to the reality of God. But ends are more important than means, because they are chosen by the heart and the will and love. And love is more important than technique. And therefore, the most important difference is not the difference between the technique of supernatural magic and the technique of natural scientific technology, but rather their common goal, or love, which is the love of power. Science and religion, on the other hand, have different techniques and methods, but the same goal, namely conformity to objective truth, to reality. Science conforms the mind to the truth of nature, and religion conforms the mind and heart and life to the truth of God. In the last chapter of his Discourse on Method, about the utopian results that Descartes hopes to achieve by that method, he reveals his hope to return to Eden, or progress to utopia, through the unlimited potentialities of future technology. He says this is advisable not only for the sake of an infinity of devices that would enable us to enjoy without pain the fruits of the earth and all the goods one finds in it, but that we might rid ourselves of an infinity of maladies, both of body and mind, and perhaps also of the enfeeblement of old age, were one to have a sufficient knowledge of their cause and of all the remedies that nature has provided for us. In a private letter, Descartes confesses his most radical dream of the conquest of nature's trump card, death itself. He writes, "It should not be doubted that human life could be indefinitely prolonged if we only knew the appropriate art." Here Descartes predicts exactly what Lewis warns against in The Abolition of Man, that this conquest of nature can become the conquest of human nature, and the abolition of all diseases and perhaps death itself, thus prophetically forecasting the dark dreams and devices of the so-called transhumanists in Silicon Valley, who are seriously working on the conquest of nature's trump card, on artificial immortality by genetic engineering. If this ever actually happens, I think that would elicit the second coming and the end of the world. Because a race of immortals living in this fallen world by their own fallen, foolish, prideful flesh would be like rotten eggs that never hatched. They would close the door to their own teleology, their own end. To quote Lewis one more time, "We are like eggs at present, and you can't just go on being a good egg forever. You have to either hatch or go bad." Joshua, Jesus' predecessor and namesake, gave God's chosen people this most fundamental choice before they were about to enter the Promised Land. He said, "Choose ye this day whom ye will serve, whether the gods of Canaan or the gods of Egypt, but as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." That is the ultimate meaning of the momentous choice that is put before Western civilization and before every single individual in it.